Alright, well, this is APUS history. We are not in class right now. You're online, obviously. We've been talking in class about the French and Indian War, and today we're going to be talking about the results of the French and Indian War. Now, because we're not in class, because you're at home doing this on your own time, just remember, you have the ability to stop, pause, rewind, go back and do this whenever you want to. You'll probably need to do that because I expect that you're taking notes as you go through and do this. You want to have all this material in your notebook. Now, since we're not in class, you will probably have a couple questions about what's going on. It's important that you ask those questions to me online by making comments. If you don't, it's not going to be very good. You're going to be kind of dumb. So let's make sure you're doing what you need to do to get an A in this class, because if you don't do it, so we want to make sure you pass. And again, we are doing the French and Indian War today. Okay. Okay, so we are talking about effects of the French and Indian War. First of all, let's just remind ourselves that the British defeat the French in the French and Indian War. So the British are successful. One of the first big results is that Great Britain essentially takes all of the French territory that's in North America. That was one of the results of the war, in that the British forced the French to basically cede them all of their territory in North America. Now, if we look at a map of North America, this map is prior to the war, so this is before the war. If you look at the pink territory, that is British territory. You can see the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, and then up around Hudson Bay, that's more territory that the British had up in Canada, but a lot of area in gray in basically Quebec, down around the Great Lakes, Louisiana, that's all French territory. So the French had a lot of territory in North America prior to the war. After the war, however, it's going to be quite different. The map that we're looking at now is zoomed in on the eastern half of the present-day United States, the Atlantic seaboard and up into Canada, and as you can tell, there's no French territory anymore. The British had basically everything east of the Mississippi River. And that bordered with Spain. Spain had everything west of the Mississippi River, but the French no longer have any territory in North America. They've been totally cut out. So this is going to be a pretty big change for the British, because they have a massive amount of territory now that they are now in charge of, that they did not have prior to this. Another major issue that the British have is simply the fact that in fighting the French and Indian War, it was very, very expensive, and they built up a pretty massive debt over that period of time, and this really changed the way that they had to operate as a colonial power. So if we take a look at those two things together, they have a large amount of additional territory that they did not have before, and they have a massive debt. They viewed the colonies as essentially not being the cause of the war by themselves, but bearing some degree of responsibility for it. The war was fought to protect the colonies. It expanded the amount of territory that the British had in the colonies, and so therefore the British are going to basically totally reorganize the way that they run and manage the colonies. And that's going to be pretty different, because up to this point, the British had essentially left the colonies alone. So those are some of the effects that the French and Indian War had on the British Empire, but it also had a big impact on the colonists. Now, for the first thing, the colonies had to fight against the French by themselves for the first 2 years of the war before the British got involved. Now, that by itself is important, because it caused the colonies to have to work together. But also, it really helped to kind of mask some of the regional differences that were there. We talked about the New England, the Middle, the Southern colonies. People viewed themselves very, very differently. They viewed themselves as part of their colony more than they viewed themselves as being Americans per se. So the idea that they're working together against a common foe is very important. Now, this picture right now that you're looking at is probably the first political cartoon in America. It was done by Benjamin Franklin in 1754. This is oftentimes used around the Revolutionary period, but it was actually done during the French and Indian War to try to get the colonies to unite together against the French. You can see obviously the snake cut up with each part representing a different colony. But that's going to be important because that mindset of colonial unity is already present. Now, finally, the actions that were taken by the British, both during the war and after the war, are going to begin creating powerful impressions in the minds of the colonists. Now, during the war itself, the British essentially looked down upon the colonists. They viewed that the colonial militia was not able to handle things on their own. And so it really demeaned the contributions that the colonists had, the contributions they had given to this war. And this is especially important considering that for the first almost 150 years of existence, the British had essentially ignored the colonies. They had let them operate on their own. We have a term for this, basically, this idea of salutary neglect, where the British had ignored the colonies, let them operate on their own, but now as they're beginning to get more involved, the colonists are not going to like this. They're going to push back from it because they were used to operating on their own. Now, finally, Native Americans. Now, there were some Native Americans on both sides during the French and Indian War, although more of them were aligned with the French. Once the French had lost, this is just another stumbling block for the Native Americans. Obviously, disease, expansion of white settlement. This war would have a negative impact on many tribes who are continuing essentially to collapse. So the British have all this additional land now after the French and Indian War. They've got a higher debt. They know they have to reorganize their empire. They know they need new sources of income, but they can't necessarily tax citizens back in England anymore because they're already paying very high taxes. So they want to start changing policies so that they're not having to spend quite as much money. One of the things they did was they passed something called the Proclamation of 1763, which set up the Proclamation Line of 1763. Now, if we look at this map right here, again, this is the territory that the British received after the French and Indian War. So it's everything east of the Mississippi River. However, they were concerned that settlers would move into Native American territory and cause more conflicts. So what they did was they set up this proclamation line. It essentially ran the length of the Appalachian Mountains, and what it said was that settlers could not settle west of this line. So the colonists essentially had to stay to the east of it. They had to stay along the seaboard. They cannot go into present-day Ohio, Tennessee, those regions. And colonists were furious about this. They felt that they had fought the French to gain this territory. Why should they not be able to go and have access to it? This land was unsettled. It was very cheap. Well, unsettled in the sense that the only people there were Native Americans, but it was very cheap. Whereas the viewpoint from the British was that they did not want these settlers to cross over the line because that would then possibly cause more conflict with the Native Americans, and then British troops would have to go in and try to fix the situation, and that would cost money. So you've got two very different viewpoints going on here. You've got the colonists who want to move into this territory to use it, and then you've got the British who want to leave it for the Native Americans because they don't want to have to pay the money when conflicts eventually do arise. So this is going to be a major problem point between the British and the colonists. Now, even though this line was set up, colonists still crossed it anyway. They ignored the order, at least a lot of them did. Obviously, there are not going to be British troops along every single foot of this line from Maine down to Georgia. So it was pretty easy for colonists to pass over it, but they still didn't like the fact that they were being told what to do, especially after they had just fought this war to try to gain access to this territory. So in the years after the French and Indian War, we see a lot of changes that are very different from what things were like in the colonies prior to it. British troops are permanently stationed in America now, in the American colonies. This had not been the case prior to the war. Manufacturing in the colonies, which was very small, however, those people who were involved in it were typically more wealthy, influential people up in New England. But colonial manufacturing was limited so that it was not going to compete with British industry. And if you're a colonist and you're involved with a manufacturing or any other type of industry, you're going to be pretty unhappy about that. But what's going to cause some of the biggest problems is some of the acts that are passed by Parliament and the impact that it has on the colonies. Now, the Sugar Act is something that is going to increase the tax that's on sugar coming in, which obviously means the colonists have to pay more, so they're not happy about that. but it also sets up courts that were going to try smugglers, which there was a pretty good amount of smuggling going on in the colonies, and this was one of Britain's first real significant attempts to try to crack down on that. The Currency Act basically said that each individual colony could not print off their own paper money, which means you either had to barter with someone or you had to use um, gold or silver or some other type of valuable item, because if you couldn't, it was very difficult to get your hands on paper money from England, versus when the colonies were printing off their own paper money, it was much easier to get access to it. So it made things much harder for the colonists as far as transfer of currency. Finally, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is going to be a big one. What this says is that there was going to be a tax placed on any type of legal document, any type of printed document. So newspapers, magazines, anything like that had to have this stamp on it, which it was not allowed to be published without it. So all it's doing is raising the cost of this stamp, or raise the cost of that printed document because it had that stamp on it. So it's just making things cost more, and the colonists deeply resented this. So one of the important things to also remember is that the colonists still viewed themselves very much as being residents of their colony. So someone might think of themselves as being, I'm from Massachusetts, I'm from North Carolina, much more than they thought of themselves as being Americans. Obviously they shared some characteristics, but they were still quite very different. But there were also differences in economic levels as well. So there might have been some challenges between, say, poor farmers and the aristocracy. There were issues between if you lived in a city versus on the countryside, if you lived in the north versus the south. So there's a lot of differences between these different groups, but these British policies are going to begin to create common grievances among all of these people, because many of them have issue with what Great Britain is doing. That's going to be very critical to understand, is despite people having all of these differences, they begin to have this one common thing that is uniting them, and that is opposition to British policies. People who had not been involved in government before are beginning to get involved a little bit more so than they had before, and that's going to be critical as we get through the 1760s and into the 1770s. Now, two things that are on this slide right here, the Paxton Boys and the Regulator Movement. These are two fairly important events that are taking place. I want you to make sure that you add them into your notes and do a little bit of outside research on them. See if you can get a good baseline of information. If you have any questions about them, make sure to email me or add some comments in on Facebook.